A neighbor looks out her window and sees a car in a ditch. A bus driver slows down, rolls down his window, and asks a young woman if she's okay. She tells him she's fine. She tells him she's already called for help. Neither of those things is true. 10 minutes later, police arrive at that exact spot on that exact road, and the young woman is gone. Not hurt and limping toward a house. Not walking to find a phone. Gone. No footprints leading away that anyone could follow. No blood. No straged. Her purse is still in the car. Her cell phone is still in the car. Her shoes, heeled boots, wrong for snow, wrong for a 10-mile walk through the White Mountains in February, are still in the car. 22 years later, nobody has found Maura Murray. Not her body, not her belongings, not one confirmed sighting, not one credible photograph, not one piece of physical evidence that tells her family what happened in that gap of time between a bus driver's kindness and a police officer's flashlight. Tonight we're going to walk through what is actually known, what has actually been confirmed by investigators, family members, and court and police records. Not the message board theories, not the docuseries dramatizations, not the TikTok slideshows built for engagement instead of accuracy. Just the case, in order, the way it actually happened. Before we start, this case centers on a young woman who has been missing for over 2 decades, and her family is still searching for her today. If this kind of story sits heavy with you tonight, that's okay. Take care of yourself as we go. If you want to follow along with every twist in this one, hit subscribe now, because we're about to spend the next 2 hours inside a single February night that has never fully been explained. And drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching this from tonight. I read every single one. Before Maura Murray was a case number, a docuseries subject, or a name shared across 1,000 true crime channels, she was somebody's daughter. The fourth of 5 children born to Fred and Lori Murray, raised in the small town of Hampshire, Massachusetts. Her parents split up when she was young, but by every account, both of them stayed deeply present in her life. Something that would matter later, when both of her parents would spend decades separately chasing down the same unanswered question in their own ways. People who knew Maura growing up describe her the way people often describe someone gifted enough to make it look effortless. She was a standout runner, competitive at cross-country and track, disciplined in a way that suggested she was building towards something specific. She was smart enough and driven enough to earn a spot at West Point, the United States Military Academy, one of the hardest schools in the country to get into, let alone thrive at. She didn't stay. At some point during her time there, Maura made the decision to leave West Point and transfer to the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she began studying nursing. Her sister Julie has said publicly that nursing suited her, that Maura had spent time as a teenager volunteering at a nursing home where her mother worked, and that she genuinely enjoyed the company of the elderly residents there, sitting with them, making them laugh, listening to their stories. It wasn't a resume line for her. It was something she was drawn to. By February of 2004, Maura was 21 years old, a junior nursing student, with what looked from the outside like a fairly normal, if quietly stressful college life. She had a boyfriend, Bill Roche, a West Point cadet she'd stayed close with after her own departure from the academy. She had family nearby. She had, on paper, nothing that obviously pointed toward the events that would unfold that week. But if you look closely enough at the days right before February 9th, 2004, and investigators, journalists, and amateur researchers have spent 22 years looking as closely as anyone has ever looked at anything, you start to see a pattern that doesn't quite fit normal. If you're new to this channel, this is Crime Time, Cold Case, and every episode we go this deep. Full timeline, full context, no shortcuts. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Now, back to the week that changed everything. To understand what happened on February 9th, you have to rewind several days because the version of Maura Murray who drove north into New Hampshire that night did not arrive there as a woman with no warning signs. She arrived there as a woman who, in the days before, had already started quietly unraveling parts of her own life, and nobody around her fully understood why. Days before her disappearance, Maura was involved in a minor car accident of her own. Not the one that would end her public life, but an earlier fender bender using her father's vehicle, reportedly in the early morning hours after a door party. It was minor. It was the kind of thing college students deal with and move past. But it meant that in the days leading up to February 9th, Maura had accident report paperwork on her mind. Paperwork that, strangely, she would go out of her way to retrieve duplicate copies of on the very day she disappeared. In the days before, those who spoke with her described a young woman who seemed distracted, stretched thin, occasionally tearful. On one of those nights, she reportedly grew visibly upset during a work shift and had to be walked back to her dorm by a supervisor. She had a long phone call with her older sister Kathleen that same night, reportedly about Kathleen's relationship troubles rather than anything about herself, which in hindsight, her family has noted is very in keeping with who Maura was. She was the one who held space for other people's problems, not the one who unloaded her own. Then came a day itself. On the morning of February 9th, Maura withdrew $280 in cash from an ATM. She packed up her dorm room, not a small overnight bag, but by multiple accounts, a fairly complete packing of her belongings. She printed driving directions to Burlington, Vermont, and made calls to lodging in both Vermont and New Hampshire, apparently searching for a place to stay that had nothing to do with any planned school trip or family visit. And she emailed her professors. She told them there had been a death in her family, and that she would need to miss the coming week of classes. There was no death in her family. Nobody has ever identified who or what she believed had happened, or why she constructed that specific story. It is, to this day, one of the single most examined details in the entire case, because it tells investigators something crucial. Whatever Maura was doing that day, she believed she needed cover for it. She wasn't simply taking a spontaneous drive. She was building herself several days of assumed absence before anyone would think to look for her. She also stopped by a police station that afternoon and picked up duplicate copies of the accident report from her earlier fender bender, paperwork that would later be found inside her car after she vanished. By late afternoon, she had purchased roughly $40 worth of alcohol. She got behind the wheel of her black 1996 Saturn sedan and began driving north, away from campus, away from Amherst, into New Hampshire. At 4:37 p.m., she placed a call to her own voicemail. It lasted 4 minutes. Nobody outside of Maura has ever confirmed exactly what messages she was listening to in that call, or from whom. Somewhere around 7 p.m., driving on Route 112 through Haverhill, New Hampshire, in the White Mountains, on a dark, snow-covered, sharply curving road, Maura lost control of her car. It left the road and came to rest against a snowbank, stuck. Before we go further into the crash itself, I want to know something. Drop a comment right now and just tell me, where are you watching this from tonight? I love seeing how far this story reaches, and it helps me know you're still here with me as we get into the part of this case that nobody has ever been able to fully explain. At approximately 7:27 p.m., a local resident named Faith Westman looked out toward the road near her home and saw a car sitting in the ditch. She called it in. What Faith Westman said she saw in that moment has become one of the most debated single details in the entire case. She described seeing what she believed was a man near the vehicle, smoking a cigarette. Her own husband, who was present, would later contest that account. He said what he actually saw was more like a small red glow in the darkness, not a clearly identifiable person smoking, and he was less certain it was a man at all. Sit with that for a second, because it matters more than it sounds like it should. This is the first, and in some ways the most consequential, contradiction in the entire Maura Murray case. Two people standing in roughly the same place, looking at roughly the same scene, coming away with two different impressions of who or what was actually there. Was there a second person at that crash site at all? Was it Maura herself, alone, and the shape and shadow simply got misread in the dark and the snow? Or was there someone else present in those first few minutes? Someone whose identity has never been established 22 years later? Nobody has ever definitively resolved it. At 7:29 p.m., just 2 minutes after that call came in, Haverhill Police Officer Cecil Smith was dispatched to the scene. Based on his known route and later interviews about that night, his drive to the crash site would have taken somewhere in the range of 15 to 18 minutes. In that gap, between the neighbor's call and the officer's arrival, a school bus, driven by a local bus driver named Butch Atwood, came upon the crashed Saturn. Atwood stopped. He rolled down his window and asked the young woman behind the wheel if she needed help. According to Atwood's account, Maura told him she was fine, that she'd already called AAA for a tow, and that help was on the way. He offered to call the police for her anyway. She reportedly asked him not to. He left the immediate area, but circled back later. A decision that, in hindsight, likely places him among the very last confirmed people to see Maura Murray in person. By the time Officer Smith arrived at the scene, Maura Murray was gone. Her car doors were locked. Her purse was still inside. Her cell phone was inside. Her shoes were inside. Airbags had deployed. There was visible damage consistent with the crash into the snowbank and surrounding trees. And there was no sign, no footprints that investigators could confidently trace to her. No blood, nothing, indicating which direction she had gone, or whether she had walked away from that spot under her own power at all. Route 112 in that stretch of Haverhill sits in the middle of the White Mountains. Dense woods, steep terrain, isolated stretches with few houses, and, in February 2004, essentially no cell coverage to speak of. In one direction, miles of forest. In another, the Connecticut River. It is, by any honest description, one of the least forgiving places in the northeastern United States for a 21-year-old woman in a light jacket and heel boots to be walking alone at night in the snow. And yet, within that narrow window, somewhere between roughly 10 and 18 minutes, Maura Murray disappeared from that location so completely that, 22 years and multiple large-scale searches later, not one confirmed trace of her has ever been recovered. If this is the kind of case that keeps you up at night wondering how something like this is even possible, that's exactly the kind of story we build this channel around. Smash that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and let's keep going, because what happened in the search that followed raises just as many questions as the crash itself. Search efforts began almost immediately and, in the years since, have expanded into some of the largest and most sustained search operations New Hampshire has ever conducted for a single missing person. K-9 units, cadaver dogs, state police, FBI involvement, and repeated ground searches across multiple decades have all been brought to bear on this case. A level of sustained institutional attention that most missing person cases never receive at all, let alone 2 decades in. None of it has produced a body, a confirmed piece of physical evidence, or a single verified sighting. That silence has done something particular to this case that's worth naming directly. It created a vacuum, and for over 20 years, that vacuum has been filled by theory, speculation, docuseries dramatization, and an enormous amount of amateur internet investigation, some of it careful and well-sourced, a great deal of it not. One of the most persistent leads came years later, when Maura's father, Fred Murray, received a tip suggesting that a body might have been buried in the basement of a home located near the crash site. A home Fred reportedly tried, unsuccessfully, to gain access to for roughly 14 years, as the original owners never allowed him inside. When the home eventually changed hands, the new owners did let him in. Private investigators using cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar reportedly got hits at the exact location Fred had been tipped about years earlier. That led, in 2018, to an official search of that basement by the FBI, New Hampshire State Police, and the Attorney General's office. After examining the site, investigators publicly stated there was no evidence to suggest a body had ever been buried there, and that the ground-penetrating radar had most likely picked up on disturbed soil rather than human remains. It's worth being precise about that outcome, because it's exactly the kind of detail that gets exaggerated in retellings of this case. The search happened, it was real, official agencies conducted it, but did not yield the evidence many hoped for. In 2022, 18 years after Maura vanished, New Hampshire's Attorney General announced another large-scale ground search involving roughly 35 personnel from the Attorney General's office, state police, and Fish and Game. Investigators were careful to clarify that this search was not prompted by any specific new piece of evidence, but was instead part of an effort to more thoroughly comb over areas that had already been searched in the past. Maura's sister Julie described the family as encouraged by the fact that a case nearly 2 decades old still had investigators willing to walk the ground in person, in an active, physical search. And the effort has continued since. In 2024, New Hampshire authorities released an age progression image of what Maura might look like today, more than 2 decades after she vanished at 21. And by early 2026, the state's cold case unit publicly reaffirmed that they are actively applying newer investigative technology, including approaches like facial recognition and LiDAR mapping that simply did not exist as usable tools back in 2004, to both the existing evidence and any new information that continues to come in. As of the 22nd anniversary of her disappearance this past February, officials stated plainly that their determination to find answers has not diminished, even after all this time. Real quick, if you made it this far into the video, drop a comment with just the words "still here" so I know you're actually watching and not just letting this play in the background. I read these, and it genuinely helps this channel keep making cases like this one. Now let's get into the theories, because there are really only 3, and each one changes everything about how you see this case. Over 22 years, virtually every theory floated about what happened to Maura Murray collapses down into 3 broad camps. None of them has been proven. All 3 remain, technically, on the table. The first theory is that she walked away from her own life on purpose. This is the theory that has, historically, gotten the most oxygen, and it's also the one that Maura's family has spent years actively pushing back against. The case for it goes like this. In the days before she vanished, Maura fabricated a story about a death in her family, packed up her dorm room, withdrew a significant amount of cash, and researched lodging in a completely different state. None of that sounds like a woman planning a quick weekend trip. It sounds, to some, like a woman planning an exit. Add to that the emotional strain she was reportedly under in the days before, and you have a picture some investigators and amateur researchers believe points toward a voluntary disappearance. A young woman who, for reasons of her own, chose to walk into a new identity and never look back. The problem with this theory is what she left behind. Her purse, her phone, her shoes, her car. If Maura planned to disappear and start over somewhere else, she left behind virtually everything a person would need to survive that transition. Identification, money access beyond the $280 cash withdrawal, appropriate clothing for a New England winter. Her credit cards were never used again, not once in 22 years. For a theory built on the idea of someone smart, resourceful, and deliberate enough to plan a disappearance days in advance, the total absence of any resource use afterward is a significant hole. The second theory is that she encountered someone dangerous after the crash. Under this theory, in the gap between the bus driver's kindness and the officer's arrival, or sometime shortly after, as Maura tried to walk toward help in an unfamiliar, dark, rural area, she crossed paths with somebody who caused her harm. This is the theory Maura's family has become increasingly vocal about in recent years. Her sister Julie has said publicly and directly that the family now believes it's most likely Maura encountered foul play after leaving the crash scene. A significant shift in tone from years of the family fighting a narrative that painted Maura as someone who simply chose to vanish. The terrain itself supports at least the plausibility of this theory in an unsettling way. Route 112 is remote, largely unlit, and was essentially without cell coverage in 2004. It would not have been difficult, investigators have noted, for someone passing through, a stranger with no connection to Maura at all, to encounter her on foot in the dark and never be identified, then or now. The third theory is that she died from exposure in the woods. In some ways, this is the simplest and the bleakest. Under this theory, Maura, shaken by the crash, possibly disoriented, dressed inadequately for the conditions, walking away from the road either to avoid police or simply out of panic, succumbed to hypothermia somewhere in the dense woods surrounding that stretch of Route 112. Search teams have covered enormous amounts of that terrain over the past 2 decades and have never recovered remains. But investigators and search and rescue experts have repeatedly noted just how unforgiving and difficult to fully search that landscape is. Steep grades, dense brush, and terrain that can obscure remains for years, even decades. None of these 3 theories has ever been eliminated. None has ever been proven. And that, more than almost anything else about this case, is what has made it endure for 22 years. There is no working theory investigators have been able to close the door on. Before we get to where this case stands today, there are pieces of misinformation around this story that deserve a direct correction, because Maura Murray became one of the very first missing person cases to be pulled apart, mythologized, and repackaged across message boards, blogs, podcasts, and documentaries almost from the moment it happened. That online attention has kept pressure on investigators for 2 decades, which has been valuable. But it has also meant that, again and again, rumors have circulated dressed up as revelations, and Maura's family has had to publicly separate fact from noise more times than any grieving family should ever have to. Over the years, there have been repeated claimed sightings of Maura in various states, none of which have ever been substantiated. There have been viral theories tying her disappearance to specific named individuals in her personal life, based on nothing more than speculation about her relationships. Claims her family has publicly pushed back on as unfounded. And there have been recurring waves of true crime content that present the voluntary disappearance theory as a settled fact, when in reality, as we just covered, her own family has spoken out specifically because they believe the opposite is more likely true. What's actually confirmed, as of today, is this: no credible sighting of Maura Murray has ever been verified. No physical remains have ever been recovered. No arrest has ever been made, and no person of interest has ever been officially named as a suspect by New Hampshire investigators. The New Hampshire Attorney General's office has repeatedly stated that speculative or premature public disclosures could actually hinder the investigation, which is part of why so many specifics of the active casework are never made public at all. What sits underneath every timeline detail, every theory, and every renewed search effort in this case is a family that has now spent more than 2 decades without an answer. Maura's sister Julie has become, over the years, the most visible and consistent voice fighting to keep this case active in the public eye. She has described their mother's memory of Maura in the simplest human terms: a young woman who would have been embarrassed by all the attention now surrounding her, who wasn't the kind of person seeking a spotlight, who volunteered with elderly nursing home residents as a teenager because she genuinely liked hearing their stories, not because it looked good on paper. Julie has spearheaded an online campaign dedicated to keeping her sister's story alive, maintaining a dedicated website for tips and updates, and in recent years has taken the case to platforms like TikTok specifically to reach a generation of viewers who weren't even alive when Maura first disappeared in 2004. She has also launched a podcast, driven in part by a desire to reclaim her sister's story from years of noise, speculation, and mischaracterization by people who never knew her. The family has, at points, taken matters into their own hands entirely, including hiring a private investigator, a former police chief, after growing frustrated with the pace of the official investigation, and personally pursuing tips like the basement search that Fred Murray fought for over more than a decade. New Hampshire's Cold Case Unit has continued to publicly affirm its commitment to the case well into 2026, stating plainly that decades passing does not diminish their determination to find answers for Maura's family, and confirming that they continue applying modern investigative technology that simply didn't exist back in 2004 to both old evidence and any new leads that surface. If Maura's story means something to you tonight, do 3 things before you go. Subscribe to Crime Time, Cold Case, so you don't miss how this one develops. Hit that like button so this reaches someone else who might know something, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because cases like this one have been solved before by exactly the kind of person scrolling through a comment section at midnight, recognizing a detail nobody else connected. As of this recording, the disappearance of Maura Murray remains, in every official sense, unsolved. No body. No confirmed suspect. No definitive explanation for what happened in that gap of minutes on Route 112. What has changed over 22 years is the sophistication of the tools being pointed at the case, and the persistence of a family that has refused to let it fade. New Hampshire's Cold Case Unit has confirmed the active use of newer technology on both old and new evidence. Searches have continued as recently as 2022, decades after the case began. An age progression image was released in 2024, a quiet but pointed reminder that investigators still consider finding Maura, not just closing her file, the actual goal. And at the center of all of it is still just a family. A sister who has turned grief into a 2-decade campaign for answers. A father who spent 14 years trying to get through one basement door. A mother who lost a daughter described, by everyone who knew her, as someone who would never have wanted this much attention on herself. Somewhere in New Hampshire tonight, the woods along Route 112 sit quiet under whatever weather has come through this winter, holding whatever answer they've held for 22 years. And somewhere else, a family is still waiting for someone, anyone, to finally bring that answer home. If you have any information related to this case, New Hampshire investigators have consistently encouraged anyone with credible leads to come forward directly through official channels rather than social media. That's where this one stands tonight. If new developments come in on this case, we will be back with an update the moment they're confirmed. Before you go, subscribe to Crime Time, Cold Case. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and let us know which theory you find most convincing. Did Maura Murray walk away on her own? Did something happen to her on that road? Or did the woods simply take her before anyone had a chance to help? We'll see you in the next one.